It just was kind of strange to me to see a lot of white LGBTQ people and even like some black people say, oh, I really, really like Chappelle and his old comedy, but now he's punching down on vulnerable people. And I'm like, he was always punching down on vulnerable people.
It's an extremely difficult and painful time to be trans. There are all these bills around the world, and he's adding fuel to that fire, I think.
There's this idea that straight black men just die, and it's just such a default baseline condition.
Would you agree with me that at core to a lot of this is this claim that in today's world, there's a certain currency to victimization? That is part of what's driving this oppression Olympics. And that ironically, even though Dave Chappelle seems to be critiquing that reality, he is himself fighting for a kind of premier victim status for Black people because he feels like people don't care enough. I'm very glad to be joined today by Trevor Beaulieu. You know him, you love him from Champagne Sharks. He's a friend of the show. He's been on lots of times before. He is not only one of our favorite podcasters, he's also an immigration lawyer. Welcome, Trevor.
Thanks for having me. I'm always glad to be here, and seeing your wonderful camera quality is like watching a TV show. It makes me feel inadequate, but I'm glad to be here.
Well, look, we'll get you there, Trevor. We'll keep sharing specs, and I'll keep sharing what setting powder I'm using until we get you to the quality level that you want.
Yeah, until we get me presentable to the world.
And we're also joined today by Dr. Stephen Thrasher, who is a professor of journalism and LGBTQ health at Northwestern. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Thrasher.
Thanks so much. It's great to be back with you again.
Yes, we had a great episode about COVID stuff back in the fall, and we have to have you on to talk more about that going forward. But today, I am so glad both of you were willing to submit yourself to the gauntlet of talking about one of the hottest button issues that there are right now, which is the new Chappelle show, Closer. Now, this is the closing act, as it were, of a series of his Netflix specials, each of which has been met with a more controversial response from the public than the last. I want to start by asking you, Trevor, do you think this bad boy should have aired in the first place?
I am fine with it airing, and I'm also fine with other people, having problems with it. Like because you can't speak for everybody, but I mean, I had no problem with it airing. I thought it had some good bits. I thought it had some good parts. Some parts I thought went on too long. Some parts I got the point he was trying to make, but I thought he could have made it in a better way. And some parts I, thought were spot on. But I mean, in general, unless something is like really threatening, like the public health or like the safety of people, I am not the kind of person that, just thinks that, things should be kept from airing. But I know that's also a point of distinction because some people actually do think that this threatens the public health and safety of some marginalized groups. So to the extent that I don't think it does threaten those groups, I do not think it should be censored, but I understand that my opinion isn't the be all end all on this, and some people truly do think that this is something that escalates to an actual existential and physical threat to trans people. So,
well, Dr. Thrasher, you're somewhat of an expert in this area, so let's put that question to you. What do you make of the claims that some of the jokes told in this special, jokes that talk about beating up lesbians or are arguably diminish the concerns of trans people in particular, put them at a higher risk of physical violence or even legal threat?
I think it's a very fair critique, and whether or not something is allowed to be aired or not, it's certainly very ripe for critique. I very much understand why people are criticizing it, and understand from trans people I know and writers I read why they do find it to be an existential threat. I have not watched the entirety of this special. I've watched clips from a bunch of parts of it. I've read a lot about it. And I think that there is a very good case that it's creating a quite hostile environment. I was disappointed by how he was framing trans people in general. And I think it's strange that Netflix has come out in so many ways for Black lives and for Black trans lives. And last summer, a year ago, when a lot of the protests were being led by Black trans people, I don't think that they would have released this special with a white comic using the same kinds of jokes about Black people that he is using against trans people as a cis person. And his framing was really upsetting in the way that he did something I've actually not heard many Black public figures do before, and that he really posited being LGBT or particularly T as being white. That was how he was coding it. He talked about whether or not somebody was trans or whether they're Black, and he talked about the LGBTQ community punching down on Black people. And so that one erases the idea that there are, of course, well-established histories and current culture of Black trans people and Black LGBTQ people. But it was also strange the way he was framing the idea of punching down, because the people he's talking about punching down are himself, Kevin Hart, DaBaby, Black performers who are doing quite well financially. They're not being canceled. They're probably not going to be canceled economically. And I don't think that that's a good frame to think about punching down on them when people who are legitimately afraid of their lives and in many ways are in popular culture positioned the way Black people were 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and wanting not only bad stereotypes about themselves and not only wanting images that cause harm. I don't think it's a fair thing to say that those people who are quite in positions of precarity can punch down on celebrities. Celebrities are there to be critiqued. They don't just have to be worshipped or have media in the world that nobody says anything bad about.
Right. So there's one critique that says, cancel culture is often talking about people who are very rich and powerful and obviously aren't canceled. Chappelle's special goes forward. He's got lots of money. I think you're right. One of the weakest points is when he brings Kevin Hart into it at the end. And he literally says, taking a man's livelihood is akin to killing him, talking about not canceling folks. And then immediately talks about, well, obviously Kevin Hart isn't dead, which, why would you even say that taking a man's livelihood is, as much as I may or may not be pro firing someone in any given instance, he sets himself up for failure. But he is, I think, also making a different critique, which is that he, rightly or wrongly, perceives it to be more socially acceptable to make a certain critique of Black folks than it is of certain members of the LGBT community. And in doing so, to your point, he erases the extent to which obviously there are lots of Black people in the LGBT community. But also in the anecdote he talked about, he said he was in a bar and ended up basically in a confrontation with a large white guy who, as they were about to get into it, he realized was gay and then worried, oh shoot, this isn't going to look good for me. Right. And then when the confrontation escalated, that the white gay man went to call the cops, and then, he goes on and says basically that, gay people are minorities until they want to be white, like they need to be white. And I feel like that's a critique I've heard from plenty of Black members of the LGBTQ community as well. And I wonder what you make of that and if there was any legitimacy there for you in that critique. Dr. Thrasher.
Well, that kind of critique is a legitimate critique. I don't think that he's making it in a very good way, because he's also doing these other harms at the same time, and he doesn't seem to be putting that kind of analysis to the kinds of people he's talking about in the other parts of the special. And ironically, he is kind of reproducing some of the harms that he's talking about in that piece. So when the Stonewall riots happened in the late 1960s, there are these different ways that the LGBT community comes together and pulls apart around racial identity and around class solidarity or class stratification. And in the Stonewall riots in the late 1960s, you had a very cross-class, cross-racial coalition that was yelling about and fighting back against police brutality and really about economics. The people in the Stonewall bar were being shaken down by the mafia and by the police, and you had a quite wide swath of people. And so it's uneven, but there was a lot of class difference there, and there was kind of a coalition that was fighting around LGBTQ rights or rights around sexuality, intersected with all kinds of racial fights as well. The Black Panthers were a part of it. The Latin Kings were a part of it. There were all kinds of fights for racial justice that were overlapping with this coalition. And so you have a loose and uneven coalition, but some kind of coalition that exists for some time. Then as you get to the 70s and 80s, the same neighborhood where this happened, the West Village of New York, you do also have white gay people starting to buy property in these places. And two of my colleagues write about this well, Sarah Schulman and Christina Handhart. You could look at these neighborhoods in New York that did become kind of gay enclaves, the West Village, which was a lot of gay men, and Park Slope, which was a lot of lesbian women. And then you did start having, as certain members of the community, white members of the community, were buying property, they would start calling the cops on other people in the neighborhood. There's this great irony now in the West Village where the piers are just off of the village.
Right.
Anyone who's seen Paris is Burning or Pose knows that like these are scenes where a lot of the ballroom stuff happened, where kids who didn't have a home to go to would sleep out at night. And so for property values, a lot of the gay homeowners don't want them in the neighborhood. Literally put barriers up around it during Pride, have ended up having a fence on the pier so people can't sleep there overnight. So there are these critiques that are fair about what happens. And Chappelle, I don't think, is making that seriously because if you have that sort of analysis of what happens class-wise and what happens in terms of racial identity, sexual identity, and class, then you wouldn't see trans people who are extremely precarious to losing their livelihoods and are extremely precarious to being harmed by the police, particularly when they're also trans people of color. You wouldn't see them as being powerless when they're critiquing a celebrity. I don't think he's coming at that kind of analysis.
Right. But I do think, like, obviously, like I said, the celebrity critique is one thing, but I think the thrust of what he is doing, effectively or not, is to ask the question of whether or not there is a kind of a hierarchy of oppression that exists where people feel less at risk of social backlash or being critical of Black folks. I want to pull up a tweet from you, Trevor, where you said, I get people who never liked Chappelle complaining now, but when I see people who admit to loving the older stuff getting on a high horse, it feels off to me because he was mocking vulnerable people back then too. Want to unpack that for us?
Yeah, my basic thought is that if I can understand some people who just thought that he was always bad when it came to mocking marginalized people and stuff, and that consistency, I can appreciate, but it just was kind of strange to me to see a lot of white LGBTQ people and even like some Black people say, "Oh, I really like them." I was responding to a particular thread where the person's like, "I really, really like Chappelle and his old comedy, but now he's punching down on vulnerable people." And I'm like, he was always punching down on vulnerable people. But then people will defend that to me by saying, "Oh, but it's okay because it's in group. So it's a Black straight man making fun of Black people." But I mean, we realize all the time with people like Candace Owen and Larry Elder that just being of the right group doesn't give you a pass to say whatever, especially if I don't think the in-group argument counts when you have an out-group audience. Like, for example, my family, can make fun of me and then they can joke and say, "Oh, it's okay because, we're family." But if the missing context is my family was making fun of me in front of people not in the family to make them laugh and to get more popular, then it wouldn't be the same thing. Like my sister or my aunt or my cousin can't say, "Oh no, it's within the family." It's like, no, dude, you're doing this to make other people laugh at me and to increase your own popularity. So I just feel like, in a way, that discourse kind of adds to Chappelle's point about that. I just think Black people are just kind of seen as being born to suffer. So there's a certain amount of suffering or acceptance of a degraded condition that you just are supposed to accept out the gate, and if it happens to other people, that's a bridge too far. So seeing this person complain that when you make fun of vulnerable people, that's a step too far. But I mean, he's making fun of crackheads. He's doing minstrel
And that
bits of
wasn't in
blackface.
group. I mean, as far as I know, as far as we know, that wasn't an in group joke. As far as I know, that, you know, Dave Chappelle has never been addicted to crack cocaine. So that level of excuse kind of goes out the window. And so I want to pull up a specific joke that he does later, which I thought was interesting. He basically says, in direct response to the criticism he's gotten over his LGBTQ jokes, that they weren't actually ever about, I'm not talking about them, I'm talking about us. Like, these jokes weren't about members of the LGBTQ community in so much as they were about his feelings about how the Black community is treated in these spaces. And of course, he very famously walked away from a $50 million deal because he felt like people were laughing at him rather than with him with respect to these jokes that were largely along the lines of racial humor. And his argument is that he is drawing contrasts in order to reveal the hypocrisy of society, basically. And so in this one joke, he says, why was it easier, or why was it easier for, he says, Bruce Jenner to change their gender than Cassius Clay to be accepted for his new name? And I think he very purposefully used, said Bruce Jenner and then Cassius Clay. Almost, it felt like he was trying to set a trap of sorts, for people who were very, would say, okay, well, why are you dead naming Caitlyn Jenner? And then he could reply, well, why didn't you have an objection to me saying Cassius Clay? Like, I can feel his brain working. He's setting up all of these parallels, and it's like bait. So what do you make of that? Is it as simple as, okay, that's a false equivalence, and changing your name or changing your religion isn't as stigmatized and isn't the same as changing one's gender expression, or living your life as your true gender expression? Like, what is the difference?
So there are a couple of interesting things about Caitlyn Jenner. And I remember when she came out, it was the same week that Rachel Dolezal was exposed. And so there was this immediate conflation with, is this, fraudulent, the same way that Dolezal was largely framed, not entirely, but largely framed as a fraud. And Caitlyn Jenner being exposed as a fraud. And Caitlyn Jenner was mostly accepted in a lot of press. Not entirely, but had certainly a pretty warm reception compared to other trans people who've come out.
Chappelle's point was, in Caitlyn's first year out, she won Woman of the Year, and he makes a joke about, he's, in her first, she beats every woman in Detroit, where the special was, and how are you supposed to feel about that?
Right, and so Caitlyn Jenner is, it's an extreme person to pick because she's already a celebrity, she's attached to one of the most famous families in America, is quite well off economically, in terms of race, very much codes as white, which is a big part of what my problem with the way that he's talking. Has turned out to be a Republican, has been extremely anti-LGBT and extremely racist, and anti-immigrant and lots of problematic positions. Caitlyn Jenner is not representative at all, I think, of the lived reality of most queer people. And so a critique against her, I think it's kind of a false critique, because she doesn't represent what reality is for most LGBTQ people. I think that Muhammad Ali, even though he, of course, became a very famous person the world over, was very representative of the struggles of Black America. And the kinds of things that he were going through, even as a celebrity, were representative of the ways that Black people were disrespected, the way that they're not allowed to have contentious political opinions, that they couldn't be against the war. And so I don't find them great to compare to each other. But Caitlyn Jenner is someone who comes up in these conversations a lot, and just, the way she is, she ran for being the governor. It's a convenient person to go against because she's not a kind person. Has a lot of offensive political opinions to the left broadly, and she has a lot of money. And going after someone like that creates the illusion that itself, I think, is a very racist illusion that gay people LGBT people are primarily white, that we're primarily rich. And it's an outdated paradigm. Like some of the critiques I've read about Chappelle, they just seem out of step with the times. So around the time when he first had his TV show, Will and Grace was probably the broadest cultural reference point people had for gay people. And that created also the idea that gay people are rich white men who live in Manhattan, which is not the reality for most queer people. And Caitlyn Jenner kind of is in the same mode. In between these 20 years, we've seen so much more culture, even in the mainstream culture, through Pose, through all kinds of things, showing that so many queer people and trans people are Black, and they're poor, and they deal with HIV disproportionately, and they've dealt with COVID disproportionately, and they deal with homelessness disproportionately. So I think for Chappelle to kind of skip all of that and hold Caitlyn Jenner up as the ideal is very unfair to the reality of most LGBT people.
Well, let's say hypothetically, let me play little devil's advocate here. A lot of the references that he used were celebrities. You know, I take your point about Muhammad Ali, you know, because he was his involvement in the civil rights struggle, because of his conscientious observer status and going to jail, was very much kind of like putting himself in the line of fire and is suffering similar experiences to your average everyday Black person. But a lot of the examples that are used here are other celebrities. So he said he's bringing up, you know, DaBaby getting so-called canceled, which, you know, is extremely arguable.
He has 2 songs in the top 100 right now. So
right. For his comments at a concert, which imply that his LGBT fans had AIDS. And he compares that to the amount of backlash that DaBaby didn't get for shooting someone in a Walmart, which, if you Google it, apparently was self-defense. And so, I mean, I don't really, that, again, not his strongest point. But there does seem to be, to me, another argument that he's making here, which I wonder if, separate apart from David Chappelle, you feel is resonant at all about the relative treatment, because even Caitlyn Jenner, you know, even celebrity to celebrity, there's an argument that Caitlyn Jenner has still a certain degree of acceptability within liberal spheres, despite her politics, despite her behavior, despite all of these other things, on the axis of identity that some of these Black actors, like, you know, public figures, don't. I want to, Trevor, go ahead and get in here.
I just want to add one thing. By the time Muhammad Ali had the press conference to change his name, he was already an Olympic champion, and he was a 7-year pro career and was already a world heavyweight champion professional. So I don't think, you know, you can say that he wasn't a celebrity either. You know, it wasn't like early Cassius Clay. He was already a world phenomenon at that time. I just wanted to add that to the context.
You know, I think there's also something interesting here where when I watched the whole special, let me say, I planned this before I had watched the whole special, which I watched about an hour before we started recording today. And I thought I was going to have it was going to be a lot more cut and dry than I feel now. And I'm just working through my feelings kind of live with you guys. But what became clear as I watched the whole special was that he was making a point about the relative value of kind of symbolic performative gestures versus one's kind of sincere commitments to the substantive rights of a given community. And I was reflecting on, you know, the way that he, you know, calls women bitches and, you know, uses the N-word a lot and, you know, is generally irreverent. And that has been a part of his comedy from the beginning, and something that nobody really seems to think means that he is, you know, anti-woman per se, in the same way that some of his jokes about trans people have been described as transphobic. And I think it's because on some level we understand that he's winking and nodding. When he opens with a joke about, you know, being molested by a priest, I don't think anyone believes he was actually molested, or that he thinks molestation of kids by priests is okay. But we understand that he has a kind of shock jock humor, and that he's making people laugh by saying things that are not supposed to be said out loud. And it feels like during the course of the special, what he's doing is saying, I'm going to continue to do those, you know, I'm going to, you know, fly in the face of controversy and say the things that I know that we're not all supposed to say, and articulate a certain discomfort that many folks in the public feel with the pace of change in the world, rightly or wrongly, and give voice to that at the same time that I reaffirm my commitment to the substantive rights of LGBT people. So he has a whole bit about how anti-trans bathroom bills are wrong. In fact, someone in the audience starts like clapping when he brings up a trans bathroom bill. And he's like, no, actually, that is a bad bill. And then he tells a whole kind of absurdist bit about how he wouldn't want a trans person, a trans woman having to urinate at a urinal next to him because that would be absurd. Now, substantively, there's a lot of reductive, spicy descriptions of trans people throughout, but the gist of the joke is I support the substantive right in the context of the bill and people's right to safety and all these other kinds of things. Do you think it's fair, given that kind of like contrast he's setting up is fair, that there's a kind of performativity arguably about what we care about with respect to these issues, and a willingness to write people off as, capital T transphobic or capital R racist or capital S sexist or whatever it is, depending on the context, because of some kind of like growing pains or discomfort with how the world is changing, even if they substantively would back various rights and interests of these groups?
Well, I don't find his arguments compelling. I think that if he says he's against these bills, he wouldn't be telling the kinds of jokes that he's telling. And I think it's a very different dynamic to think about how he's talking about a joke about molestation. He's not making fun of people who are molested in that joke. I think he's sort of making fun of the people in power in the other position, the molesters, the church or these institutions that protect them. Here, he's actually really going after the people who are in the crosshouse right now. And it's an extremely difficult and painful time to be trans. There are all these bills around the world, and he's adding fuel to that fire, I think. In terms of separating him out of that argument, and as you brought up earlier, a hierarchy of oppression, which he has made it really difficult because he's already coding being LGBTQ as white. He's not even thinking about the intersectionality of being both of these identities, which many people are. But there is like a complex of performativity, I would say, taking him out of it that does happen in some of these organizations like GLAAD. There are organizations, the Human Rights Campaign, they would give awards to Andrew Cuomo. They gave awards to Michael Bloomberg.
Right.
Michael Bloomberg was the mayor of the city of New York, and they clapped and cheered and gave him their #1 ally award because he was for gay marriage. At the same time, he was running the NYPD, which was the biggest threat to LGBTQ people, particularly those of color. LGBTQ people broadly are poor and are affected by police and incarceration and poverty and bad healthcare, even across class lines, but across racial lines, but particularly amongst LGBTQ people of color. And so some of these organizations will praise people like that. Some of them praise Caitlyn Jenner. And I do think that's extremely wrong. You don't want to be praising someone who's against not only LGBT rights, but who's vehemently against immigration and racial justice rights, because they're doing the same kind of erasure, I think, that Dave Chappelle is doing. They're performing an allyship with someone based on one identity, but they're ignoring that person is rich and white and of a high class status at the expense of thinking their positions could be very bad for the majority of people who are LGBTQ. And something like that happened with Kevin Hart too. Kevin Hart did lose his acting gig at the Oscars. And I should say I'm not particularly a fan of either of Kevin Hart or of Dave Chappelle. But I remember writing at the time when he lost his job, he was very helpful in the idea of the Black homophobe. And again, sort of saying like, you're either Black or you're LGBTQ. And Kevin Hart was unapologetic about the things that he had said about gay people. He would not back down from it. And there were like other awful things that he had said that did not get the organizational attention that did. And I do think when Gay Inc. does that, I think that they are wrong. They should not be holding up some celebrities and trying to take action against other celebrities if they have nothing to say about racial justice and if they have nothing to say about economic justice. And a lot of those gay organizations don't take positions on those things. They don't take positions on immigration, on Medicare for all, on things that really would help LGBT people. And so they just kind of pop up in these moments of pop culture, pylons. And so people don't take them that seriously.
But that's the argument, right? Like I think the argument, what he's trying to expose here, arguably, and obviously you don't have to agree that he's done so effectively, is that there are a lot of people who are very mad at him right now, people who did not support, let's say, the Medicare for All candidate whose Medicare for All bill would have made it so that trans people could get gender-affirming surgery, right? Who thought it was more important for Bernie to put pronouns in his bio than to actually have health access for vulnerable populations, who thought it was more important for Hillary Clinton to be a woman than to be equivocal, for her to be unequivocal about the Hyde Amendment, right? And on and on and on down the line. And, we're all Black here. So we are all very familiar with the idea of someone who is going to like say the right thing, put a Black square in their bio or whatever, hashtag Black Lives Matter. But at the end of the day, have no commentary about Joe Biden's history of pumping up the carceral state, who has never had a Black person over for dinner or slept over at their house or used their bathroom. And I feel like there was something, what I didn't expect to get from the special, despite all of the legitimate criticisms, is this very strong theme coming out about the substance versus the superficial. And, in his own crude way, when Dave Chappelle says, he calls himself a TERF, and it's clear when he defines TERF and then defines his beliefs that he doesn't actually think he's a TERF. But he's saying, okay, fine, I'm not afraid of the label, but I'm then going to go tell a joke about, I'm jealous of glory holes and I want to try one out. He says it much more vulgarly, as you can imagine. But he's willing to kind of say, I will support a bill. He tells a long anecdote at the end that we should get to about a trans friend of his named Daphne, all of these things. At the end of the day, I'm willing to put my body on the line. I'm willing to do the Muhammad Ali thing and go to jail and substantively rather than just performatively be a part of this. And you can argue about whether or not he's done enough there also. But that there is a gap between people who exclusively want to have this kind of top level conversation about whether I said the right thing at the right time, who refuse to acknowledge any growth, et cetera. And I think when I was reading the responses to these on YouTube, watching some of the videos that people had put out, there was a huge swath of the country that undeniably is in a very different place than kind of the media sphere about trans issues. And I couldn't help but challenge myself by asking, is a special like this going to help people who might legitimately be transphobic? People like the person who woo-wooed at his rally to say, oh, actually, Chappelle is not transphobic. He shut me down when I tried to woo-woo at his rally, and I should support the basic rights of these populations. Trevor, I want to give you a chance to get in here.
Okay. It's kind of weird because there's so many things said that I kind of want to respond to and everything. So I was just going to back up and then work my way to the current question.
Sure.
The way my brain works, I'll forget all this stuff if I don't say it. But with the in-group thing, right? Okay, let's say he's not a Black crackhead, but crack is a scourge that disproportionately affected the Black community, and the effects of it are still being felt. So to me, it's it would be if a gay comic was had an AIDS character or something, and that gay comic may not have AIDS, but by making a mockery of a condition that disproportionately affected his group, I think he would be kind of, doing a disservice, especially if he's doing it for the laughter of out-group people. But I mean, he is a descendant of American slavery, and he made a joke about reparations, and the Black real world about, if you live with Black people, this is what you're going to get. Now, I'm not saying I'm offended by these things, but I'm just saying he's always been kind of doing stuff to the point where with this stuff, he kind of disgusted himself. But straight Black men die at a crazy rate, but nobody was saying, hey, I think Dave Chappelle's jokes about, Black men, that they're degenerates that you can't live with, they'll have sex with your girl, and, they're prone to being crackheads, and, they can't, if their justice claim is a joke, and if they got reparations, they would spend it on buying babies and shooting dice. No one said, hey, this is going to encourage people to kill more Black men, So I find it weird, this escalation that these jokes were going to make Black trans people get killed, because Black men have been getting killed. And when you look at the Black trans death epidemic and you disaggregate the info, because I went through all the different people, and I think in the past year was 28, and then I separate out the black people, and then the black trans people who were dying, a lot of them, it wasn't shown whether they were dying out of explicitly transphobic crimes or for other reasons. Some were, but I found mostly it was in Latin America that they were actually, for whatever reason, being killed explicitly for being trans. A majority of them were for other reasons, but when I checked the neighborhoods that they were killed in, it was always poor black neighborhoods where straight black men were dying at a similar rate. So for me, part of the problem that happens here is that it makes me feel like there's this idea that straight black men just die, and it's just such a default baseline condition that there's a way higher tolerance for it, to the point that you just kind of, it's just something you just try to get under a certain level of control. It's not something that you can actually even, like if Mark Fisher talks about capitalist realism and this idea that people can't imagine a world without capitalism, I think there's a black male death realism where people just think it's just normal. Like a win is just, are they just killing themselves at a 10-year low? That's good, So that kind of was a little weird to me. But then also, like, with all due respect to Dr. Thrasher, like Dr. Thrasher keeps saying that Dave Chappelle frames LGBTQness as just whiteness, but I do think, and he might be guilty of not explicitly disaggregating it enough, but he does make several things, because I was watching it and I took notes, and he says things like when the white person calls the cops on him, he's talking about a white person that's eating in the same fancy place that a white gay person that's eating in the same fancy place that he's eating in, and he brings up if it was a black person, they would not. If it was a black gay person, they would not have done that, because they know when the cops come, the cops aren't going to see them as different than me. They're not going to know which N-word they're supposed to be going out against. So I mean, he does acknowledge the existence of black gays, and he implicitly kind of makes clear that he's talking about a certain class demographic and race of gay people. I agree that maybe he could have taken more pains to disaggregate it, but I think it was there between the lines. He also talks about the two black gay men who were with the white trans person, and the white trans person is in his face saying, "We've had decades of struggle." And then he looks at the two black gay people like, "Are you going to check this girl?" Like,
And specifically talks about how the trans woman is like, kind of like doing the clap accent thing.
Yeah.
And he's like, "Well, who'd you get that from? Black women?" And kind of challenges this appropriate. I mean, like, go ahead. Sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah. No, I mean, and he talks about other things along those lines. He brings up Stonewall and how he thinks like they were writers for the cause, and he prefers them. But I mean, the take that I got was that he was talking about the people who tend to be the face of the gay rights movement, and I think he's talking about a certain type of white bourgeois type of gay person. And rightly or wrongly, I think he's talking about himself as a black man more than himself as a rich guy. And I think there's this kind of thing happening where it's being treated as if he's talking about all gay people and trans people, regardless of demographic and race, even though at times he has made sure to disaggregate that he's, talking about a particular kind. But then it's treated as the black stuff just to be about him, the baby, and Kevin Hart, like three rich black guys. And I think it's not quite that. I think he's trying to talk about black people as a whole. And the other thing I want to respond to is that I've seen multiple people keep saying that he lacks the intersectionality, that he is erasing black gay people and black trans people as gay and trans people. And like I said, I don't disagree because I feel like, I don't agree fully because I feel like he did implicitly do that at several points in the special. But I think even if he didn't do that, and he didn't do that disaggregation, which is fair, I feel like a lot of the critics are doing the same thing in reverse and not realizing it, because they're erasing, to me, black gay and black trans people as black people. Because who's to say when he's talking about how bad black people have it, and he's saying all these things about black people, why don't these same people who complain that he's assuming that all gay people are just white and don't include black trans or black gay people, why are they assuming that when he says black people, he wants more rights for black people, he's not including black gay and black LGBTQ in that? And I think in a way they're kind of mirroring the same intersectional invisibility that they're critiquing that he's doing in the gay direction. Like, I feel like when he's talking about black people and how far they have to come, he's including the black gay and black trans people, because white gay and white trans people, they're not dying at the same rates that the black trans people are dying, but black straight men are that, like, their plight is much more similar to the life not mattering and the victim of crime and poverty, much more similar to what a black non-gay, non-trans person goes through than what a gay white person or trans person is going through. So yeah, I just wanted to get those points out before I
that was helpful. Dr. Thrasher?
Yeah, I have some things to respond. First of all, I don't agree that he's not a TERF, or certainly that he's not projecting TERF ideology, which is extremely dangerous. First comes from England, and has had lots of, particularly in England, with J.K. Rowling, but in the newspaper I used to work in at The Guardian, it's a very mainstream position. And
for people who don't know what a TERF
Sure.
is, can you define it?
Yeah, so the term TERF stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists. And it comes from, it circulated more in England initially, but it's the idea that women who say we're feminists and we don't want trans women who we don't think are real women as part of our movements. It's a very essentialist way of thinking. And it's an essentialism where you say that the characteristics of life are very quantifiable and put people in a social category are extremely dangerous. It's the same thing as using calipers to decide what someone's race is, or saying that, skin tone alone determines someone's race, when race is a social construct and gender is a social construct. And so TERFs are very transphobic, and they've had a lot of room in England, but they've had a lot of circulation amongst mainstream white liberal women in the United States as well, certain TERFs as well. And so I think particularly when he says trans people are like, the TERFs look at trans people the way black people look at people in blackface. And that I find extremely offensive and dangerous. This idea that blackface and minstrelsy, which is white people mocking black people hysterically, has nothing to do with trans people who are understanding and living out their true identity. In terms of black LGBT people, I very much disagree with Patrick that we are erasing ourselves, black, queer, and trans people. I don't know any other black and queer trans people who've been talking about the special over the past few days who feel like Chappelle is speaking up for us. Sia Jones' piece in GQ is really good at writing about that. I've been reading other pieces as well, and I just don't find that a legitimate argument that he's speaking up first as well. I find that he's being very mocking and very, not you, Patrick, but Dave Chappelle, being very mocking and dismissive.
Trevor. Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
All right. Okay.
I'm sorry. I also don't think it's the onus on the people who are in the most defensive position to speak for everyone. I deal with this a lot with Israel and the BDS movement. Whenever people say, well, why is the BDS movement singling out the state of Israel? Well, because it's a movement that comes from the Palestinians in that part of the world who wanted to have a social movement that would defend them from the position they're in. I similarly don't feel like it's up to trans people to feel like they have to speak for everyone when they're in this very defensive position right now, having so many bills about them in so many states in the US, dealing with so many things around the world. But in terms of the point that you were bringing up about Black, queer, and trans people not caring about other Black lives, that is simply not true. I've been reporting on the Black Lives Matter movement pretty much since its inception, which evolved around in Florida. Why am I forgetting his name?
I want to be clear. I didn't say that I think Black, gay, or trans people don't care about other Black lives.
Okay.
If it communicated that way, that wasn't what I what I meant to say.
So the beginning of the, thank you. For the beginning of the Black Rights Movement, which originally organized around Trayvon Martin in Florida, and that's where the 3 Black women, who at least one of them identifies as queer, if not 2 of them, in Ferguson around Mike Brown, which I did lots of reporting in 2014, 2015, almost all the organizers were queer or trans that were doing the bulk of the organizing that I was reporting on. And in the movement for Black Lives over the past year, including the rally that happened outside of the Brooklyn Museum where 15,000 people came for Black Lives, that was organized by Black trans people. So Black, queer, and trans people are trying to bring together a better life, I think, for Black Americans and Black people around the world more broadly. They're not entirely caught up in celebrity culture. They're not coming from the same organizational structure as an organization like the Human Rights Campaign or GLAAD, one of these places that is very involved with Hollywood and celebrities. They do have a very good class analysis. They understand the role of police brutality, and they organize these things like that March of 15,000 people, like the alternate gay pride that happened last year, which was a gay pride parade dedicated to Black lives and against police brutality. And so I don't find that the offense that they are taking around transphobia that is intersecting with an extremely dangerous point around transphobia right now is fair. I'm not saying that there isn't systemic racism against all Black people. There still is. But I think in terms of messaging, it is much more difficult in popular culture, news, and government to explicitly say that you're against Black people and the segregation of Black people. Of course, covert discrimination still happens, but the overt stuff is not said the same way. But the overt stuff is really happening around trans people right now. And so I understand why they are organizing and fighting.
but look, here's the thing. Like, the whole problem here is that it's an oppression Olympics game, which shouldn't be played in the first instance. But it does feel like, okay, you have all of these voting rights bill, all this legislation aimed at preventing people of color from voting. You also have these trans bathroom bills and prohibitions against students from competing in gender segregated sports and all this stuff. Both things are happening at the same time. So it does give me pause when there's an argument made one way or the other, that it's harder to discriminate against Black people publicly than it is to discriminate against trans people. Like, obviously, I think that on some like basic level, we have Loving v. Virginia. I mean, there's like, we fought a civil war. There's been a civil rights movement. Certain things have been enshrined into law. But would you agree with me that at core to a lot of this is this claim, and I saw this in another podcast about the subject, another YouTube video, where they were arguing that in today's world, there's a certain currency to victimization. Victimization is currency, they argued, in the public sphere, rightly or wrongly. That's not to say that the victimization isn't real or substantive or anything like that, but that is part of what's driving this oppression Olympics. And that ironically, even though Dave Chappelle seems to be critiquing that reality, he is himself fighting for a kind of premier victim status for Black people because he feels like people don't care enough. That he was allowed to crap on Black people for the first half of his career and everybody thought it was completely fair game. But suddenly when he does it about other groups, that is offensive.
Well, I think, and again, I'm not someone who's watched Dave Chappelle closely throughout his career. My father, who's passed away, was from a certain civil rights generation where it's like we're not listening to anything in this house that is derogatory to Black people. Rap, hip hop, comedy. That was like kind of the household that I was raised in. I don't think it needs to be an oppression Olympics. And I do think, the point you're bringing up about voting rights. So people are largely against bills that are getting rid of voting rights. They understand there's a racial dynamic. It is not called a bill against Black people. It is called, a bill against voting rights, which brings together a broader coalition. The trans stuff is explicitly talked about as being anti-trans. But I also want to say, in so much of my reporting around many issues, education reform, voting rights, environmental stuff, there are queer and trans people in them. They are the leaders, even when they're not saying, I am queer, I am trans. They are the ones who are so affected by it, who are doing lots of the organizing.
For sure. So that's part of the point I was making, right? Like, because we have had a civil rights movement, because racial identity is legally protected and constitutionally protected, you cannot make a law that says I want Black people not to vote without it getting struck down. The same thing is not true of trans people because they don't have the same protected class status. People are arguing for it under, like people are making the case, but at present you can have a more explicit bill for trans. So that is, of course, there are like meaningful differences that are created by our historical legacy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the impetus or the apathy that's driving either of these cases is necessarily neutered. I don't think you would argue. I think that people would be mad if you argued that these voting rights bills were racially neutral or weren't motivated by the political reality of conservatives knowing that if more Black people vote, their political destiny is less Tony.
No, I wouldn't disagree with that, but I'm saying that there is a difference in the way that it's narrated, and partially because of that, I think it brings in liberals who feel like it's sort of an all votes matter approach. They sort of see all people need to be able to vote, and so they have more buy-in into it. But so many places I've reported on these kinds of things, a lot of that organizing is being done by queer and trans people, even when like that's not the identity that they're putting forward as the primary reason why they're doing the organizing. And I think similarly to the way that the United States broadly leans on the African American experience, as Biden would say, save the soul of the nation, stuff like that, that we look to as a nation to the experience of African Americans in all kinds of walks of life, the environmental movement, feminism, the gay rights movement. A lot of that is drawn on what's happened previously from the racial civil rights movement of the early and mid 20th century. And I think we're at a time right now where a lot of contemporary organizing, including the Black Lives Matter movement, is itself been deeply affected by the fights for queer and trans rights. And a lot of those people are organizing those campaigns. So even in times when that's not the identity they're putting forward. And I think you raise a very interesting point that, he's trying to position himself as the ultimate victim in these Olympics. But we don't need to be fighting with each other about this. And the people who are, even though it's like a word that gets a lot of derision these days, people who live aware of and in practice of their intersectional identities, I find are actually the ones who are often the best at coalition building. The Combahee River Collective statement very clearly says they want a world where Black women are going to be free, because if Black women are free, that means all the other barriers of oppression have been dismantled. And they say very clearly, we want to work in coalition with other people to this goal. And I find that many more trans and queer activists are in that spirit than they are reflective of someone like Caitlyn Jenner or someone like, GLAAD, this media organization that does take a very myopic view of gay rights and does not look at what's happening broadly, economically, and racially that's affecting queer people.
Yeah. I want to bring this back to the episode a little bit, because you raised the turf point, Dr. Thrasher. And I will say, I do think that was the dumbest part of the special by a long shot. And there's a good reason why there's a lot of a negative tension on it, because his knockdown, drag out, like his like period on the end of the sentence that he thinks is making some slam dunk point is to proclaim gender is a fact. And this gets big applause. And he does the whole kind of like, men having babies, that's insane. Don't you know that every person on the planet has to come out, pass between a woman's legs to be born? And even if, I don't want to be making his arguments for him, but if he had said, biological, and I know this is about to be real turfy, but even if he had said like biological sex, if he had said, okay, some people are born with ovaries and some people are born with, and obviously there's intersex people and all kinds of things on the spectrum, but even that would have been firmer ground than gender, which nobody is arguing as a fact. Like gender, by definition, is socially constructed. Like there's not even an argument about that. And
lots of people argue for that.
Okay, but that's just stupid. If you want to talk about sex, just talk about sex. Like there's a reason the word gender was invented, like separate and apart from sex. I don't even know. Like, so I don't know why he didn't have a copy editor. I don't know if he was going to go this hard in the paint and claims to have, friends from the LGBT community. Like that wasn't even just a place for him to start. But I am curious about this because it does keep coming up that this is the conversation we have more broadly. I have about the left more broadly, that there are these typical, I should say, these kind of like generalized ways that most people understand the world, rightly or wrongly. And changing norms creates dissonance. It was true with racial integration. It was true with women entering the workforce. It was true with gay marriage, and it's true now. Trans people are at the, front edge of cultural change right now and are drawing a lot of focus for that reason. And when we talk about this on the left in other contexts, and some people are mad at me about this in these other contexts as well, there is this question of the difference between kind of a cancellation or a writing off and a kind of, they're not there yet, but we're going to work with them and get them there. And this is a conversation we had with India Walton, the soon-to-be, God willing, mayor of Buffalo, who's facing this recall effort, who is a socialist and a leftist and all of these things. But it's like, look, sometimes when I go into these spaces and I'm trying to talk to people about, Republicans cutting their Medicare or whatever, it would be not productive to the goal here for me to go in and introduce myself by my pronouns, which is going to derail the conversation into a conversation about pronouns, which is not necessarily what I'm trying to sell politically right here in this moment. And I'm curious about the extent to which fighting on, there is kind of an unwillingness sometimes in some quarters to even acknowledge that dissonance, and the dissonance and a dissonance that comes out in his special as a weird focus on the genitalia of trans people and stuff, that dissonance may be something different than transphobia.
All right. I wouldn't use the word dissonance. I would use the word conflict. And conflict can be very productive. I don't think anybody should feel that they have to be a model of respectability politics to partake in politics. I don't think people who are Black should feel like they shouldn't be in political spaces because the conversation might become about race. I don't think that people who are trans or queer should feel like that they have to hide who they are. There are times that you may not have any sense who they are. There are times that you may know very clearly that someone is queer or trans. No one should give a shit. They should feel no sadness, compunction, or shame about being who they need to be. And if they need to be vocal about it and have people understand where they are in relation to each other, that's fine. I don't think that it has to be an either or. And I certainly don't think that trans people are unaware of the need for things like Medicare for all. Trans people are the most affected by health disparities that make them have more difficult and sometimes shorter lives. Right. Martin Luther King, and there's going to be, and maybe, we'll have to see it before we judge, but it may be the first good thing Obama has done in his post-presidency. Obama's producing a film about the life of Bayard Rustin. And Rustin was around with King, and he was raised Quaker and was, socialist, helped plan the Poor People's Campaign, was a big part of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and planning the March on Washington. And he always lived as an out gay man, and people wanted King to jettison him because they said, this can sink our movement. And King didn't. King wasn't, waving a rainbow flag. That didn't exist yet, but, King wasn't an out and out gay rights activist, but he also refused to jettison this person who was one of the most intellectually important people to that campaign.
Wasn't there some narrative about him not being able to speak at the March on Washington or some event that he was precluded from because of some?
Well, he speaks at the moment. He reads the 10 demands that they have, including the demand for $2 an hour, which would be the equivalent of about $17 an hour now, which we still haven't gotten to. But yeah, he was pushed into the background. He didn't get the kind of shine someone like Andrew Young did that he probably should have had. But I think it's a cop-out to say that if we talk about someone's pronouns, to me, it's the equivalent of saying if we just talked about racism the right way, that people would undo structural racism. It's bullshit.
Is that what's being said? Is that a parallel statement? You know, because as a Black person, let's say, when I was on the trail and talking to, in some southern state and talking to some white person, I simply led with the issues that I assumed, and I also could be assuming wrong, but assumed based on sizing someone up, were going to be most germane to their life. That doesn't mean I don't care about the other issues. It doesn't mean that I'm going to downplay or not fight as hard for those other issues. But person by person, I think the point India Walton was making. Person by person, if I'm in a Uber in Iowa talking to a white person on the way to the Bernie rally and they ask, well, where are you going? And I say a Bernie rally and they go, piffed. And I make my pitch. I'm going to say, well, let's talk about your rights here as an Uber driver or lack thereof. Let's talk about why it is that you're needing to supplement your income. Let's talk about if your healthcare costs are high and if you have, family members on one of these government, social Medicare, Medicaid that are worried about not, having their benefits curbed. Let's talk about it. And I think that the resistance to even doing that sometimes on the left is it is interesting and maybe speaks a little to Chappelle's point about the weight that we put on kind of the virtue signaling, if you will, versus the substantive advocacy and the efficacy of that advocacy.
I mean, you could say, well, we're going to Iowa and we shouldn't send Black people there because that might freak them out. And I'm sure that there are people who have that political orientation as an approach. They might say it would be better to have someone who looks like them.
Well, don't we say that it's better to have like culturally competent people go into minority neighborhoods all the time and door knock? Isn't that an issue that we talk about in the course of DSA, that is not sufficiently representative and that sometimes our community efforts would be more effective if the diversity of the organization reflected the spaces that we were in?
But generally we talk about that, about talking to other minoritized people. We don't talk about minoritized people not being able to talk to white people. And we don't, and similarly, I don't think we should say like trans people shouldn't talk to people who are
you're
cis.
Right. We don't talk that way, but I mean,
we would say like we want other queer people. Like when I worked for the Bernie campaign, I was writing and talking to other queer people. That's the direction, because I was talking to other members of my community. But I was not told that I couldn't talk to the general audience.
Sure, I'm just saying that you raised that as a hypothetical, that it would be bad to say that we wanted to send only white people to Iowa. And I'm just saying that we do that with other groups.
We do it with we do it with minoritized group. We don't do it with dominant groups, I don't think.
Right, but my point is that there's a perfectly legitimate argument that we should send Iowans to Iowa, and Iowans are mostly 90% white.
Right.
So that
So yeah, you might send a Black Iowan, or you might send a trans Iowan, and you might find that people connect very well. But again, like I reject the premise that it's either or. That if someone talks about pronouns, that it's virtue signaling, and they don't care about these other things.
Well, not that it is virtue signaling, Dr. Thrasher, but that would you acknowledge? Would you agree or not that there are people who are, let's say, India was saying, the example she gave was in an old folks home. So would you agree that there are probably a plurality, a majority of older people who, whatever their feelings about trans people on an individual basis, are not on the front edge of that issue, are not, super understand, like genuinely do not understand really what this is all about, just because it's their old dogs trying to learn a new trick?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. One is that we should never pander to people's prejudices or undersell where they might meet us, because we're not sure where they might meet us.
Is it pandering to someone's preferences for India Walton to introduce herself as India Walton as opposed to, hi, my name is India Walton and my pronouns are she, her?
I don't think there's a problem with either one.
Okay, but if she chooses to do the former, because in her experiences, it leads to a more productive political conversation, is that pandering to ignorance or pandering to transphobes or pandering to bigots?
If we're going to say that one must do that, I mean, people communicate in ways that are often quite casual and spontaneous.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying, no, you must always introduce yourself with your pronouns. But if someone feels compelled to do so, it's no better or worse than someone who doesn't. I don't see that it would be, and I certainly would not think that if we have a trans person working on a campaign that we want to tell them, you must only identify yourself in a way that we're going to tell you. They should do so how they're comfortable doing.
Certainly. But it is the case, though, Dr. Thrasher, that there were a lot of people who were very angry at Bernie for not putting his pronouns in his bio, even at the same time. Like, there were people who would openly prefer not to vote for Bernie because of something like that, despite his advocacy, his singular advocacy for Medicare for all.
My experience in the campaign and as a reporter before the campaign is that there are people who pressure their candidates to do what they want them to do. That doesn't mean that they don't agree with their platform or that they're not going to vote for them.
But Dr. Thrasher, you know the crap. I'm trying to avoid saying her name. It rhymes with Pilafedic. But there are people like that who were like hardcore for Warren. Bernie sucks. Screw Bernie. Even though the writing was on the wall, Warren has a right to stay in and ruin Super Tuesday. Like all of that stuff that has real world consequences over a lot of this super. I'm not saying the fact of
she is not representative of trans people.
Well, she's not trans at all.
That's my point. Yes, that's what I'm saying.
But this isn't an argument about trans
so
people.
To hold that up is like.
But Dr. Thrasher, this isn't an argument I'm making about trans people. Very few actual trans people are in the grand scheme of this conversation are a part of the conversation just numerically. The people who are mad on the internet, the people who are like engaged in this conversation are overwhelmingly not trans. A lot of the people who are angry about this special are arguing from a position of, quote unquote allyship. And so the question is are people holding up? And I think, and I want to get back to, some of the specifics of the show and get you in here, Trevor. But I mean, I'm
enjoying listening, so by all means, just continue. It's very educational.
And you can stay a little bit longer, so maybe if I can, Trevor, I'll keep you after even Dr. Thrasher has to go. But okay. The point, he tells an anecdote at the end about basically a trans woman named Daphne who opened for him on a show. And she kind of bombed and wasn't very funny, but seemed to be in good spirits about it. She sits down in the front row while Chappelle does his set. And there ends up being like some back and forth with an audience member and Daphne, where she parries a kind of transphobic, sexist joke. I think it was someone in the audience shouts at her, "Did the cartons match the drapes?" And the audience is kind of like tense. And then she responds, "Honey, I don't have drapes, I have hardwood floors." And everybody laughs and like she's bodying great. But then he talks about how they had a relationship after the show and how he was going to help her with the routine and all of this stuff. And then when his Netflix special came out, one of the last ones, she defended him on the internet, got a lot of hate from other members of her community, and ended up committing suicide like a few days later. And Dave Chappelle was talking about how he set up a trust fund for her daughter and, kind of ends on this joke. I mean, about how she was, I don't think that she was a member of the trans community. She was a member of my community. She was a comedian who loved dirty, inappropriate humor. She would have loved the jokes that I'm telling about her right now. And I'm the one who stepped up and did the thing when it was important. I don't know what trans people did for her. Maybe they did actually do stuff for her. So that's neither here nor there. But again, kind of highlighting the idea conceptually of substantive commitment over being upset about, language usage or something like that.
Well, I do have to go in a few minutes. It is not either or, and I don't like this paradigm of saying people either do these things, they're substantive or they're all talk. And that part of the routine I find very disheartening. First of all, you can't talk about someone dying by suicide and assign it to any one factor. It's not.
No, he didn't. In all fairness, he says he doesn't know what caused it. He doesn't know what was going on.
When he said, what did the trans community do for her? He's also implying that they do nothing for each other. And it's almost like he's, it's like when, some white people say, like, I did this thing for my black friend and nobody in the black community cared about it.
Or why don't black people care about black on black crime?
Right. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so that I found that was one of the things that made me angry is he's implying that trans people don't care about other trans people, that they just let each other die when this beneficent millionaire is willing to set up a trust fund for his friend for a memorial for their family. Of course, that's a good thing to do, but I really resented the implication that LGBT people don't do things for each other, and particularly trans people. Trans people are on the forefront of mutual aid. Dean Spade's book about mutual aid is fantastic. They highly have to rely on each other when the state fails them, because the state and capitalism have failed them the most. And so they do giving circles, they take care of one another, they share what they have. They were the models that the society at large needed to adapt to during the pandemic when the state abandoned so many people. And so I really, that was probably the thing that I found the most distasteful, was his implication that trans people don't care about or take care of one another.
Yeah, the Daphne thing, it had potential, but he really just did not, he took it too far.
Yeah, I think he felt the pressure to keep undercutting any moment of sincerity with some edginess, and I wish he kind of just stayed in the sincere space a lot more. I think it ended up working against him for the sake of some cheap laughs. Yeah.
Dr. Thrasher, I really appreciate you hanging in there for some of my, I know, kind of frustrating devil advocacy here. Can you tell people where to find you and your work? And T, if you don't mind hanging around just for a few more minutes, I want to just cover some of the other aspects of the special.
Sure, no problem.
Thanks. So I teach at Northwestern University, where I'm the Daniel Renberg Chair. I focus on social justice, and particularly on the LGBTQ community. I'll be doing a couple of public events on Zoom, and I'm finishing my first book, The Viral Underclass, which we talked a bit about the last time I was on. It's going to come out, hopefully, late next summer. I tweet at ThrasherXY, and thanks for having me on. And the last thing I'll say is it's never either or. All people who fight for social justice do so on many fronts, and I find the ones who are willing to put themselves into uncomfortable spaces or with uncomfortable conversations are often also the ones doing the most substantive movement-based work as well.
I think that's a really important point, and thank you for closing
Nice
out
meeting
on
you,
that.
Dr. Thrasher. Take care.
Nice meeting you too. Take care.
Here's a question that we probably should have asked up top. Did you enjoy it? Did you think it was funny?
I will say this. I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought, because the way it was preemptively framed, and I don't know if this is your take on it, I expected it to be like, people were making it sound like it was Nanette and it had like no jokes and it was just going to be him ranting. And I mean, there was a decent amount of jokes in there. You know, whether they were in good taste or not is, you know, up to you. But one thing I found interesting from looking at all the preemptive framing was the only thing people were litigating was whether or not he was homophobic or transphobic. But I saw, despite some things that might be legitimately argued to be homophobic or transphobic, a lot of probing questions about white LGBTQ racism, like several points that people either just ignored or kind of minimized to get back to litigating whether he was homophobic or transphobic. So I feel like the discourse that happened after this and reading the characterizations of it before I actually saw it kind of proved one of his points, that people kind of care more about in this current mainstream discourse, the homophobic or transphobic issue than the racism issue. And something else that I, like one thing I want to clarify, and I hate to like respond to Dr. Thrasher after he's gone, because then it doesn't give him a chance to clarify or whatever, but it's just he had to go. I have no choice. But he responded to my point about that I think people are erasing the intersectionality in the word black by thinking that he can't be talking about black gay and black trans people. He took that to mean that I was saying that I think black gay and trans people are doing that and that they don't care about other black people. But I was talking more about the mainstream discourse and the white
allies,
the white allies, and I wasn't talking about the black trans people. And I think one of the things that kind of gets lost in examining this is that in Dave Chappelle's own words, he seems to think that this is a body of work that has to be taken together. And at one point, he even references the lines from the other three works to kind of show that he's been building toward, this, which is the finale. Like, you have to take it all together to get the context. And part of the reason why I think it's, one shouldn't be so quick to dismiss the idea that he's including black gay and black trans people when he's talking about blackness is, in one of the previous specials, he makes a point. And again, this is one of those points where, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, I saw very few people in the mainstream discourse willing to engage in it in good faith, where he was saying, if it was only non-white people or women who wanted to be trans, but white men didn't, and particularly white privileged men didn't want to be trans as well, people kind of wouldn't care. It wouldn't be getting all this traction. And in a way, that's a very intersectional point, because he's trying to say that the whiteness and the maleness and the privilege, works together with being trans to get a kind of different result in the society, that people will take it more seriously and will get a lot more rights. But if white, powerful, bourgeois people weren't interested in this as well, mainstream society would probably, consider it mostly like a quirk or still something weird. And I thought that was a very intersectional point. Maybe it's not one that Kimberly Crenshaw would make, but in the broad idea of intersectionality, I think it counts. But to me, that evidence is that he thinks the blackness of the black, gay, and trans people plays such a role that it lumps him in with the rest of black people. Like he's saying in that joke, whether you agree with that joke or not, he's saying that he thinks of the black, gay, and trans people on the side of the marginalization issue as him, as a black person, as opposed to, so yeah, that's why I think you can't just quickly dismiss that he does not think of black, gay, and trans people when he brings up the minimization of blackness, because he's explicitly mentioned that in the past.
Well, what I thought was interesting was that there was a thread of kind of class analysis throughout this that I did not expect from him. So Agreed. A lot of people were quoting his opening line about how, hey, I'm rich and famous, as like him being just a jerk. But what he was actually saying was, I'm rich and famous, so I haven't experienced COVID the way that most normal people have, and I hope you guys are doing okay. Like when I started watching the special, after having all of the presumptions that I had based, to your point, on how it had been framed, I had a very negative views going into it. I didn't enjoy the last special. I found it to be difficult to watch and had to like start and stop a couple of times. I was expecting. I confess that I'm not a long-term Chappelle fan. When people were really hype about it in college and like were watching it in like common spaces on campus, I was very uncomfortable. I was uncomfortable with all these white mixed race Harvard kids yoking it up and like being one of the only few black people in the space. And like most of the black people also seem to not have any problem with it, I will say. But I remember being uncomfortable about it from the get-go. So I've never been some big fan. But from the get-go watching this special, it became very clear that there was a significant gap between how it had been represented versus what it was. That's not to absolve it of being problematic.
Exactly. It is still problematic.
But the fact of the gap, to me, it's like, well, let's just have a good faith conversation about it, because otherwise you're proving his point in these ways. And let's just not feed that beast if we disagree with the arguments that he's making.
That was the feeling I had. Like there were so many good faith lines of attack that could be made on this special, because I think there are genuinely problematic parts.
Right.
That it was kind of bothering me that people were bringing up, like, someone made a think piece, I think her name was Akilah Hughes, saying that Chads are going to go out there and start killing trans people because of this special. And it's like, okay, it's a bit, like, why do you have to go there? There's so much on paper that we can talk about that was actually said, like this. And then, I agree with a lot of things that you say, but to add one more thing about the why I say it's about the white allies and the white mainstream gay movement, and not me disparaging black, gay, and trans people when I say what I said is, if you look at the people who are pushing the black trans narrative, of a black trans epidemic, like the hardest, it'll be like HRC, that organization. And one of the things I noticed, they always have like a yearly report and shows all like the trans people that died. And they've started like really, once like this thing about how a disproportionate amount of them are like black and poor happened, they started doing all this stuff on their site where they talk about, black trans epidemic, how hard they have it, intersectionality and stuff like that. And they're kind of using the black trans people as a way to kind of engender a lot of sympathy for their cause and to fundraise off of it and all this stuff. So I'm like, okay, that's good. But when you look at the site, and I've been looking at the site for like years now, and I look at the part that says our work, and whenever you go to the site, it's stuff like getting gay and trans people in college and professional sports, electoral stuff, bills. You look at the bills, and none of it has to do with poor black trans people. Yeah, homelessness. A lot of and if you think I'm lying, you can go to
access.
Yeah, you can go to their website and see everything that they do. You know, talking about trying to push the Equality Act, and most of the stuff in the Equality Act is none of it is really about something that will help black trans people, because the black trans people are dying in places where just black people are dying. You know what I mean?
So it's poor people. I mean, there is that
poor black people.
Yeah.
So I just want to finish this real quick. I feel there's something kind of disingenuous about using black trans people as a way to make the trans plight look extra bad, because you don't want to just have a movement that's about bourgeois concerns with marriage acts and all this stuff. I get that, but then I want to see you do a lot of stuff for these people you're using to, and I just don't feel, and it just feels kind of disingenuous, because much like, Bernie people like to point out that if you raise the conditions of all poor people, black people will be helped too. If you raise, the best thing you can do to help poor black trans people, to me, is to make the life of poor black people in general less of a living hell, Or
even if you sincerely just focused on making the lives of poor black trans people not a living hell, it would inure to the benefit of poor black people. I mean, like, either way, you're right. But it does seem to be like the poor part and the black part are not addressed, because I think even if you want to take the cynicism out of it, those require structural changes that are a lot harder than, for all that it's relevant and important, like a marriage bill is, right? Agreed. Like, there's on a certain level, on a certain really basic level, Citibank, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, their bottom line is not affected by whether or not gay people can get married. It just isn't. The same way that having housing as a human right, or people being able to leave their jobs because they're not worried about healthcare insecurity, are going to affect the duopoly, like the corporate status quo. But I do want to come back to this class point and be specific about it. So he opens with this I'm rich and famous, okay, which people misinterpreted it. And then he goes on to make several other jokes that have as their theme, when people get into position of power, they act like assholes, regardless of who they are, right? Regardless of their previous persecuted status. So, and some people were mad about these jokes too. There was a joke about how the black former slave gets a bit of land and owns slaves, gets black slaves. There's a joke about the space Jews joke, where he basically tells a story of like, what if aliens are really originally from Earth, and then they leave and they come back and they're like, this is ours, we're going to do with it what we want. And he says, we're going to name the story Space Jews. And that's a callback to a story he told earlier that basically made the same implications about how that's what's going on in Israel. You can say what you want about the substance of the joke, but when that is such a steady theme throughout, it does start to feel like he is saying something that I think is not entirely dismissible about us confusing rhetoric for power.
I mean, it shouldn't be entirely dismissible, but I think in practice, we're finding out it's surprisingly dismissible, the way people are just not talking about it. So, yeah, right. I agree. It should.
And maybe it's his fault. Like, maybe if he wants people to take him seriously, then he shouldn't, like, talk about, meaty dicks at the urinal or whatever he wants to say. Like, very that's fair. On him.
Yeah, and there's a lot of unnecessary poking of the bear that he's knowingly doing. Like, he's clearly a troll, and I think it works against him a lot of the time. Like, he's clearly getting off on saying certain things. At the most poignant part, he will throw in something really trolly. Yeah. So, but I thought that was a great point. The one where he said, even the white slave owners were like, yo, you got to chill. Like, I think that still happens today, where I feel like sometimes like these Larry Elder types sometimes say stuff where you see even the white people have to like pull back, or like with Candace Owens, Turning Point USA had to just be like, okay, chill. Like, we didn't want you to go that far. You're here to be a shield, but this shield has holes in it. We're gonna catch some strays. You have to go. So yeah, I totally agree with everything that you said. And it's funny because in this discourse now, if you're not all the way on one side, then people assume you're all the way on the other. So I've been fielding a lot of comments and things where people think I'm just uncritically championing Dave Chappelle and just giving a rubber stamp to every joke that he said. And it's not like that. It's not like that at all. I totally think there is a lot of room for improvement. And I think he ended on the type of note that he should have threaded the special with more, where he said, I'm not going to do these jokes anymore unless I'm 100% sure that we're laughing together, you know?
Right. And like, that's a great sentiment, but like, you did this whole special and said that at the end. And many of the things that you said in the special obviously don't have people from the targeted communities laughing with you. So it just seems really empty.
It sounds nice, but in practice, did you really live up to it? It's not. It's almost like a get out of jail free card. You know,
right.
Like I appreciated the sentiment, but I think it would have been better that sentiment threaded throughout the special a little bit more. But I think there's like a little vengeful side to the special as well. Yes. Like I think the hypocrisy has been kind of getting him upset, and I think that run of, and you've touched on this during this interview, and I totally agree with you that there seems to be a little bit of that residual bitterness of the legacy of his old show and what he feels like the disservice he kind of did. Like I think he feels kind of hoodwinked by privileged whites, like that he thought they were laughing with him and they were really laughing at him. And I think there's a part of wanting to give people a taste of their own medicine, but I think a big thing that's missing from all these specials I think would help a lot is he doesn't really go after like the person that you're talking about in the Harvard dorm that was laughing and making you uncomfortable. Like, yeah, a lot of these white gay and white trans people are white and behave in a lot of the hypocritical ways that white people do, but I've yet to see you say something that's going to get like the anti-woke white reactionary male crowd really mad. Like, you know, and that's who I feel were the biggest culprits of using shows like the Chappelle show, the Boondocks, or all these things as a license.
People love to watch the Boondocks in the common spaces. I'm like, why are you doing this? Let's just watch this in private.
Yeah, but they like using a black medium to do the type of minstrelsy that they can't get away with, you know, from a white person. And I wish in his specials he had some more smoke for them, and I think it would balance things out a lot more. I think I agree with a lot of his points about white, gay, and trans racism, and I disagree with some of them. But the one thing I do think is, regardless of what proportion I agree or disagree, there's a disproportionate amount of time spent on them when I think the biggest culprits were, you know, the cis straight white men bros who just really got off on thinking they had a pass to say the N-word. The same people who love the old Chris Rock niggas versus black people joke, you know, that type of person. And I hope if he comes back to stand-up comedy, he does a special that's as scorching to them as he's done to some, you know, other groups.
Yeah. I mean, it does. You can't ignore. Like, I was surprised when I heard the joke about like, oh, I had to punch this lesbian woman. And there's I mean, I'm not saying it's excusable context, but it makes more sense in context than what I just said.
And I'm hoping it's exaggerated. I want to look it up. I only just saw it before we recorded, so I didn't have a chance to get the context. But yeah,
I mean, the bit is that he was at a club or some place, and he made small talk with some woman there, and it turns out, you know, she was a partner of this lesbian woman who kind of stepped to him and was like, "Stop talking to my girl," and was looking for a fight, and he didn't realize she was a woman, which is hilarious to Dave Chappelle. LOL. And, you know, when he did, he changed his tone of voice and took a step back and was like, okay, we're obviously not going to fight. But she persisted in getting aggressive with him. And he like changed his voice and like said to her, I think he said, as a pimp would say, you know, step back, you better watch yourself. But here's the thing, like, no one's mad about him making fun of the idea that like pimps abuse sex workers.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like nobody's mad about that. Nobody's mad about the priest molestation joke. Like you can't ignore it. The hypocrisy, like the differential anger metrics here are difficult to ignore. And that's to say, like, everyone should be mad at everything. Like, that's fine.
I mean, people still laugh at, is Wayne Brady going to have to smack a bitch from the first series, when Wayne Brady was dressed as a pimp, and the humor was that he's going to smack his hose, yes.
He says, bitch, 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 all the way throughout. And I was reflecting on, like, am I offended when he's, like, referring to him as bitches? And, like, if I'm not, is this internalized misogyny? Is this my problem? Like, is it different than when he says the N-word, which I also don't care about?
Yeah.
I don't know how to answer that. Like, if you ask me, do I think that when he says, like, on some level, we live in a misogynist society. So the fact that we, like, there's like an edge and like a funniness to using the word bitch wouldn't exist if we didn't live in a society that was like misogynistic. Like if the word had like no power or no edge, he wouldn't be using it. But do I think that it is literally a manifestation of like misogyny in any meaningful way? Not exactly. I think he's just being an edgelord.
Yeah, and a particular type of edgelord, like he's a Gen X edgelord.
Yes.
I feel like Gen X and elder millennials, a lot of them, and it's funny, I think a lot of those Gen X edgelords have kind of woken up to like, okay, this is just not funny anymore. So now Sarah Silverman's talking about Jew face when she used to be one of those, female chauvinist pigs. Like, I'm going to out frat bro the bros, and people like Amy Schumer, Chelsea Handler, like they've all kind of realized, hey, that time of, trying to be more of a white asshole bro than the actual bros, that thing is dead. But I think Chappelle's richness and his social bubbles have kept him way too stuck in that Gen X specific edgelord type of. I mean, he spends all his time hanging out with like Joe Rogan and old
Bill
rappers,
Burr.
and at the end of the show, they show the people, him and his celebrity friends, and it's like, okay, there's not like a millennial in this really. There's maybe Chance the Rapper as that, but yeah, I'm like, yeah, he's doing a podcast with Talib Kweli, like he is, because I'm Gen X, and I always think, but.
And I'm an elder millennial.
Yeah, but I think like you and I, based on what we've had to do, have been exposed to a lot of different viewpoints and age groups, and I'm sure you've had to do a lot of Gen Z outreach and everything.
Yeah, and I've had to grow. Like I have been confronted with the fact that my beliefs are retrograde. Like my previous beliefs are retrograde. We just recorded an episode with my best friend from college who didn't come out until I graduated law school. So like 4 years after college. Because that was the world we lived in. Do you know what I mean? That's not an excuse, but like sometimes I feel like there's an unwillingness to even acknowledge that the pace of change is gonna it causes dissonance. And as someone who has felt dissonance, like I feel like even acknowledging that I have felt dissonance means that I am like marked, with the mark of Cain or something,
Oh, yeah.
But like it's so human. And that's part of why I have empathy when I go into other spaces like that affect me. When people are like, why are you so like willing to talk to racists and stuff like this? It's like, well, there's a racist and there's someone who just like uses the wrong lingo and isn't up to facts. And like, I'm sensitive to it.
There have been words that 5 years ago I didn't know were slurs, and people told me, online, in old tweets and stuff, and I didn't know. But it's like,
the things
if
that
I
were
wasn't
said
on
in college,
Twitter, was it?
the things that people said as a matter of like nobody, like these Gen Zers need to like Gen Xers, Gen Zers, and this is not an excuse, but like the reality of the world is that like gay jokes were completely above board like 10 years ago, like not that long ago, like no hesitation in movies and books. Go back and watch Gilmore Girls, and it's not pretty. Even like a woke show like that, Remember
Jon Stewart? He was like a woke, proto woke paragon, and he had the Chief Justice Chick with Dick's Daily Show joke.
I don't remember that. And I don't want to remember
They brought it back when he was doing the rounds a year or two ago to promote something. He was making fun of Dennis Kucinich, and I'll give Dennis Kucinich is a rare example because I think he's older than Gen X, and that dude was way ahead of the curve.
Yeah,
But he was
for
talking
sure.
about
Big
trans
rebel
rights
energy.
and having a trans Supreme Court justice in like the 2000s. I think that's what it was. And Jon Stewart was mocking him about how ridiculous it was, and goes, what are we gonna do? Chief Justice chicks with dicks, and the crowd loved it. This is the crowd of NPR tote bag loving, latte sipping liberals, and
Yeah.
they're just the joke killed, and
Yeah.
it wasn't that long ago. It's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think about this question of if there are some genuinely objectionable parts? Like, I don't think there's any getting around the absurdity and the offensiveness of gender as a fact and that whole part of the special. Like, it's just absurd.
Yeah.
And it is turfy, like definitionally. And what do you think about this argument that, if there is something that is transphobic and turf-ish, I don't know what the adjective of how do you describe it makes him a turf. It's turf lingo in the show, that it's all or nothing. Because this is the conversation that comes up with, musical artists, and do you still watch The Cosby Show, and all of these other kind of contexts. And I feel like it's just this unresolved thing that is affecting part of this debate, where obviously some people enjoyed the special for its humor value, even if they would agree with the critiques from the LGBT community.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think he was kind of overstepping his range, because to me, if you only just learn what turf means,
Right,
and
it's just
you
so
claim
stupid, man.
yeah. If you only just learn what turf is, and you've only just learned the proper definition of feminism, then I'm very sure you have not even cracked open Judith Butler. You know what I mean? So yeah. I mean, you're way out of your depth. And he has a kind of audience that, I mean, look at the audience, and there's not a ton of young people there. It's again, Gen Xers and elder millennials who remember the old show fondly. So there's not really anybody there that's going to pull his coat and tell him anything. And then the people who I think are there from those groups are kind of there with a preconceived notion of we're going to heckle him. So they're not actually kind of helping him either. They're kind of making him dig in his heels. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how to get him out of his bubble. I don't think it's going to be easy. He's going to have to actively try to step out of it. And it seemed like he was doing that to a degree with that comic that he was talking
Daphne,
about. But
yeah.
But even then, like we said before, he's too hamstrung by his need to undercut any moment of sincerity, with a joke. And I kind of get it. You don't want like Nanette 2, where it's going to be humorless and just a one-person storytelling show. But I think there were some moments where he needed to just be earnest, and I think it would have done a lot.
Like, what did you make of that anecdote he told where he was at a bar someplace rural? I forget where. Maybe it was in Ohio, where he's from.
Yeah.
And a woman at the bar, they were having kind of a nice chat. She seemed like a sweet lady. And she said, do you want to see a picture of my daughter? And he's like, ugh, I mean, no one wants to look at anybody's kids, but fine. And she showed her daughter, and he smiled and said she's beautiful. And then she acted, this is his telling, obviously, like kind of offended, and was like, she's trans, And he was like, okay.
Yeah, she was trying to trap him, basically.
Right. I mean, again, this is his framing and his telling, and maybe he's
Of
like
course.
projecting everything onto this woman. But that to me was like really psychologically revealing. That he, in some ways, like it seemed like he was saying, I played the game. I said the right thing to this woman. She showed me her trans daughter, and I'm obviously not transphobic because I said, like, I gave her a compliment and I moved on. And
but
I somehow
he also added what his real thoughts would have been, which is that she's unattractive, right?
He cannot help himself.
Exactly.
And I don't know, like, I don't know what to do with that.
Me neither. And I felt kind of funny too, because there were so many like bad faith lines of arguments I felt like being leveled at him, that I kind of felt like I had to front load, my responses to that. But after seeing the special, it really wowed me how many things he opened himself up to as far as legitimate critique that I just have seen nobody talk
Yeah.
about. Because I think everybody's circulating and using the same clips, and they
Yeah.
don't want to give the show a view. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I mean, pirate the show if you have to. Like, get a torrent so you don't give him the. But I think people should watch the whole show, and I think it would open the door to a much better conversation. Because I suspect a lot of people who are not talking about it have simply just not seen it because it's not one of the clips that
it's
everybody's
very
circulating.
different. I'm not saying, again, it's not better. It's just different. But the point I wanted to make about that, T, was like the other thing I said, the black slave, the Jews in space. The other one was the woman who has to pay alimony. That was the third one I couldn't
Oh,
think
yeah,
of.
that was a good one.
And this is interesting because that one I think we can all talk about, I kind of think more neutrally because it's not women, but like it's not one of these more recently historically marginalized groups. And people don't come for me for that, by the way. I understand that women, like, I understand the Equal Rights Act. Like, I understand. Like, please don't come for me over that. But the point is, he was talking about a woman who, because she made more money, was forced to pay alimony and joking about how she sounds just like men do, complaining about, bitches using all my money for vacation or whatever. Like, I don't remember. I'm not a comedian. And it's interesting to me because it's, again, this, like, what he's focusing down on, what's the thread that's going through all of these is like, I'm willing to say the socially acceptable thing. I'm willing to, I know I shouldn't hit women, right? With the lesbian fight example. Like, I know I'm not supposed to be transphobic. I know I should use the right pronouns, and I do. But then sometimes people act in a way that this isn't his like telling, I think what's going on with him psychologically, that doesn't, where they demonstrate they haven't earned my grace.
Yeah.
So this woman with her kid, like, I was nice to you and you still acted like a B. So this like justifies on some level my transphobic thought. Or like, I know it's not supposed to hit women, but like, give me an excuse and I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
Or like, you can't be mad at men for complaining about alimony because look, the second you are in this situation, you're going to do the same thing. Or black people and the slaves, or the Jews and the Palestinians and the space people and all of the things.
I felt very weirded out at the beating up a lesbian joke. And I kept thinking he was going to undercut it somehow in a good way. Like, saying like she beat him up or something.
Yeah.
But then when the end of the joke was, I just, gave her a 2-piece and a biscuit and that was it. I was like, okay, I hope you're exaggerating, but even if you're not, even if you are exaggerating, if that's not clear, you're still kind of making people laugh at a dangerous image. And I just found it weird that there weren't more people saying stuff like he's going to legitimize men beating up women if, they look masculine enough, and
yeah,
that was strangely one that people did not really jump on. But also the story that you're talking about with the bar, mm-hmm. like all the stories I thought had interesting nuggets to them, but first they were kind of too scrunched together without room to breathe because I feel like you had to get all the trans stuff in there. So I think that's
you had to get all the trans stuff in there.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's something that made those kind of jokes feel incomplete. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I feel like that's how I felt, at least, about those. I'm not sure if that's the right word for how you felt, but I felt there was a germ of something, but for better or worse, it was kind of truncated and
like what
really
is he saying? Like, I get the dissonance.
Exactly.
Like he's identifying points, I think, of legitimate cultural dissonance, or people are working stuff out and working out feelings like that, even if I think aren't, let's say, legitimate or good, are widely shared and worth discussing. But the conclusions that he draws are not informative. They don't push people in one way or the other, or maybe they push people in the wrong way, or they're not thoughtful. The setup is very clever often. And I laughed along for much of the lesbian joke until it ended in the I beat up the woman.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Its conclusions are very problematic, and they might even work better if they left them as open-ended questions, because there's some humorists who do cultural commentary who kind of do that, where the joke or the punchline is the open question, where it's like, you kind of have to stop and go, and that's what you're left to work with. But I feel like, in general, he wants to lead people to a conclusion or a teachable moment, and he's not always qualified to either make the right point or make the right point in the most convincing way. So sometimes either the point is wrong or the point, you can see the rightness of it, but he phrases it in a way that is hard to co-sign. Like there's some punchlines in there that I think make a good point, but they're full of like, bitch and N-word and bad trans imagery. And it's like, I can't even use this joke and the example of the good thread in it because you've just kind of salted the earth of the joke, with...
Yeah, he obviously thinks that trans people are absurd. Like, he thinks that something about it is absurd. Right? Yeah, like, that's clear fair. From the way that his focus on, like, the visual images that he paints. The idea of a trans man having to squat over a urinal trough.
Yeah,
right, to use the men's bathroom. Like he is like he's like delighting in the absurdity of it.
Yeah, and I think he thinks that being a trans ally is to still think they're absurd, but I'm giving them space to be absurd, and I'll even entertain them to a certain degree, right. Which is still, at the end of the day, kind of still insulting.
It's like tolerance as opposed to acceptance or whatever, that kind of model.
Yeah, exactly.
And this was Dr. Thrasher's point, which I think was well made, that it doesn't have to be either or, and that's what Dave Chappelle sets up. Like, yeah. But what he's really saying when he makes it an either or is, I'm going to go this far, but no farther. Like, I'm going to not be the literal definition of a zealous bigot, because I will support your fundamental rights, but don't ask me to say it's okay. And look, he's a grown man. Like, it's a free country. He doesn't have to think it's okay. But also a lot of people don't have to want to consume his comedy, go to his shows and pay him money also. So
totally. And that's something that, I was telling people who thought I was trying to defend him wholesale, where I was like, no, I totally support people's right to not like his jokes or not like him. But my only thing is I just don't like a lot of what I feel like these bad faith arguments to do that when there's so many good faith lines of attack. And also I felt weird about how people were very much dismissing the racism question and the question of, for all the people who were accusing him of ignoring intersectional analysis, I felt like a lot of people were ignoring a lot of his intersectional analysis of, how race, class level, wealth level can intersect with, homosexuality or being trans to make it. I think you're trying to say like it's not always punching down, because it's more complicated than just saying cis trumps gay or whatever. Like, there's different factors. And I would have loved to seen that engaged more in good faith, as opposed to something that you just brush aside so you can get to whether or not he's transphobic or homophobic. Like, I kind of give up on the idea of a totally good faith discussion happening of this special, but I also
we just had
don't fully absolve him of being part of the reason why it won't happen. He did a lot to guarantee there would be no good faith discussion of his better points.
Well, if you're listening and you know David Chappelle, feel free to let him know that we can have a good faith conversation about all of this right here on Bad Faith Podcast. And also, I think, it's obviously the case that it would be beneficial to have some trans cultural critics in the room as part of this conversation. So if you're listening and have any recommendations of folks who could come on and have that conversation, I think that would be great as well. When the whole Chappelle special plus the Dolezal special came out at the same time, I don't even know if I want to put out that this is out in the world, but a kind of pre-super fame ContraPoints and I had a conversation about it and tried to get to the bottom of this question of transracialism versus, transgender identity. And we were both stumbling through, right? Me, because I'm not trans, and she's because she's not Black. And there was a certain kind of equality and how vulnerable we both were having this conversation that I think made it very useful. So I would love to have some version of that conversation, which I think is in the cracks between the conversation we just had.
And it was
at
very
some point.
interesting. That conversation was about to explode in the mainstream discourse, and a lot of people don't remember this, but what Adolph Reed did a really provocative poking the bear piece about trying to compare transracialism to transgenderism and whatever. And regardless of whether one thinks it was right or wrong, I think it was set up to be an opening salvo in a very contentious debate that I was so interested in seeing how it shook out. But then at that exact moment, I remember like right when it was starting to crescendo, the Rachel Dolezal thing, that's when the Black Lives Matter media cycle started in earnest, and it kind of got lost and never picked up again. So I think it's very ripe to be picked up again by you guys. I would love to watch it if you guys.
I'm not necessarily volunteering.
Okay, well, I thought you were volunteering.
Maybe it's a premium episode. Maybe it's good premium content.
Yeah, I was trying to volunteer you because I wanted to see it, but I understand why you wouldn't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah, we'll see. I didn't even necessarily want to flag that it's out there in the world. I think Contra took it down. I don't know. We'll see. I'm gonna furiously text her after this and be like, if it's not down, scrub it. Anyway, thank you so much for spending all this time with me, Trevor, and being willing to submit yourself to these kind of nuanced conversations, the difficult ones. Can you tell our listeners where to find you and your excellent, genuinely excellent, I listen to it all the time, podcast?
Thank you so much. And guys, pressure Bree to come on. I'm trying to get her to come on to talk about.
Of course, I'm going to come on. I'm like 24 episodes now into this horrible season of In Treatment because of you. I have to come on because this cannot all be for naught.
Oh yeah. That's a good point. It's the sunk cost trap. It's the sunk cost. Yeah. But find me on Champagne Sharks anywhere you listen to podcasts. We have a streaming channel that we haven't been doing recently, but we're going to start up. But go to patreon.com/Champagne Sharks. Or just go to champagnesharks.com. All the links are there. Sorry if I spent a little too much time looking to the side, but I have a second screen with notes because I have a really bad memory. So that's what I've been doing there. But yeah, always happy to come on. And I think you did a very good job at being very fair and playing devil's advocate. I think this is probably the best. I'm not saying this just because I was part of it. I'm saying this because of your contribution and Dr. Thrasher's contribution. But I think this is one of the best good faith attempts at discussing this special, if not the only one that I found.
Well, I appreciate that, T. We're going to have to clip that and put that on the internet so people know to watch. And to all of our listeners, a reminder that this is a podcast which puts out one free episode on Thursdays and one premium episodes on Mondays every week. I rarely implore you to consider subscribing, mostly because I forget, and I'm a bad capitalist, but you should definitely consider it so we can continue to do this kind of work and some of the substantive interviews we've been doing. I want to flag that we have some really big names coming up, including Andrew Yang, Yanis Varoufakis, Ro Khanna, and I'm depending on where the schedule falls, some of those are going to be premium and some of those are going to be public. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss all of that. Plus, you can watch full video episodes of podcasts like this one when you subscribe. Obviously, the free ones are full video on on YouTube regardless. Just Google Bad Faith YouTube. You can find them there. But the full premium video episodes are also available at patreon.com/Bad Faith podcast for $5 a month. Thank you. And as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube, don't forget this is a podcast. To get full episodes, including ones that are behind a paywall, go to patreon.com/Bad Faith podcast. To get more episodes, please do subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and like this video.